It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a Tuesday edition of Locked On NBA. On today's show, we'll talk about what the Cavaliers can do to hang on to LeBron James this summer.
And the Pistons have hired a new coach. We'll talk about if former Raptors head coach Dwane Casey is an upgrade over Stan Van Gundy. It's Locked On NBA. Thank you so much for listening and for subscribing. Now let's get to the show.
You are Locked On the NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
All right, let's do this. Welcome to Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. My name is Wes Goldberg. I'm a credentialed writer covering the NBA for the Step Back. You can find me on Twitter at WC Goldberg.
And I'm David Ramil, credentialed NBA writer who's covered the league at large for SB Nation and Fanside. You can follow me and my writing on Twitter at DRamil13.
Dwane Casey has a new job in Detroit, and the Warriors will be celebrating with a championship parade today. But let's start with what will be sure to dominate headlines this offseason, and that's the summer of LeBron. It's officially LeBron free agency season, and just like we've known for months that the Warriors would ultimately end up as NBA champions, we've also anticipated that the whirlwind that is about to ensue. When LeBron was a free agent in 2010 and 2014, the league virtually stopped operations until he made his decision. After getting swept in the finals, it's clear LeBron will need help to reach that apex again and win another ring. But as Brian Windhorst recently wrote, unlike in 2010 and 2014, there may not be a perfect opportunity for LeBron. The Warriors are that good, and a move from Cleveland would only be worth it if it resulted in another championship. David, did you see anything in those finals or have any reason to believe that the Cavs could keep LeBron James?
From an outsider's perspective, no. I've long considered that LeBron is at a point where he's frustrated with that organization, that this year was the most taxing of his career. And we've seen that kind of strain that he goes through up close when he was with the Miami Heat for that fourth and final season in Miami, where you could see his attitude change. And I took a lot of heat for it at that point, no pun intended. Being critical of LeBron and saying what I thought was perfectly obvious was that he looked like he was disengaged. And I think I saw a lot of those same things from him this year. As much as they tried to rebuild the team after the loss of Kyrie Irving or the trade of Kyrie Irving, I think they kind of fell short of that. Obviously, it was a very toxic environment for most of the season. The fact that his individual greatness was able to carry them to this point far exceeded anyone's expectations, I think. Although we looked at Cleveland as clearly the best team in the Eastern Conference with, maybe a Gordon Hayward-led Celtics and perhaps Philadelphia being contenders, Toronto, obviously. Obviously, with LeBron James there, Cleveland is going to be able to dominate any individual series, and that was clearly the case. But at the same time, I don't know if there's anything there for him anymore. He's proven everything he could possibly do. He returned, brought back a title. His frayed relationship with ownership and a roster that seems so incomplete and imperfect just might have finally taken too much out of him. He might just want to look for another opportunity. And we've heard a lot of people close to him saying he values family. He values the sanity and well-being of his family and his sons, and I think for that, maybe Cleveland is a good option, but it's also maybe time to move on and see if that family might be happier and healthier somewhere else.
I mean, look, the family thing is important, and I think going into this summer and kind of the whole last few months of anticipating what LeBron's decision might be, we've obviously talked about the basketball fit and things like salary cap space and those things that are necessary, but I don't think that the family thing was talked about. And when he was asked about it after the NBA Finals, his only answer really was he's going to talk to his family, and his sons are old enough now to have a say in the decision. And maybe that was a way to just sort of not talk about any team in particular and kind of stray away from the actual question that was asked. But I do think, like we've heard Dwayne Wade recently saying, he doesn't even think it's a basketball. He doesn't even think basketball concerns will be a consideration for him. That basketball fit isn't going to be an issue because, as we saw from the Cavaliers this last season, you could surround him with anybody, and he will take that. He's got an opportunity to take that team to the finals and succeed at a very high level. But it's about his family, and so if with that in mind, I don't think that he's going to uproot that family to go to a San Antonio or a Milwaukee, who we've heard, bounced around a few times, a team that, somewhere where that, not because it's not a big market, but because I don't know, that those are necessarily great like prep school areas, right? For his sons to, matriculate through their basketball careers. I think that's going to matter, and
now,
for that reason, I think
if you're going that line of thinking, though, he's already got connections in Miami. His kids play there. His kids went to school there during the 4-year stretch that he was in Miami. Doesn't that seem like that makes sense then for a possible return to the Heat?
I mean, I think that's probably the connection that's being made and why we keep hearing Miami as one of those potential suitors. You hear a guy like Stephen A. Smith, who was the first to report LeBron's interest in Miami back in 2010. I don't know how reliable he is as a person. I don't know if it's the same source that he had in 2010 that's telling him this now, but maybe that's why we keep hearing it and why why the move to the Lakers or the Clippers keeps getting talked about because of his connections to LA and the fact that he owns homes there and that his kids are comfortable there. And I've already looked at schools there, according to some reports. So I do think that those are options. That said, I think Cleveland could do something to convince him to stay, but given how bad things were and how frustrated he was in the NBA Finals, the fact that after Game 1 he punched a whiteboard and broke his hand, I think it's going to take a lot of fixing. It's going to take a major move from Dan Gilbert and that organization to convince him to stay. Now, they've got some ammo. They can always trade Kevin Love. They have the 8th pick in the draft that they can move. And if they're able to land a superstar player that he wants to play with by using those assets, maybe that's enough to switch things up. Otherwise, I do think that relationship is pretty frayed and that there's not a whole lot of trust there. And given what happened at the trade deadline and the fact that this team had to rebuild on the fly, the fact that he doesn't really know Kobe Altman that much after just one season, maybe he does go somewhere else where he could sort of build his own team again. And maybe it is the Los Angeles Lakers, but it's got to be, again, if he moves from Cleveland to another team, they've got to put a championship level roster in place. It has to be an upgrade over what he has in Cleveland, and something that looks on paper like it could be a formidable challenge to what is going on in Oakland.
Now, I wonder about that because I feel like if he's putting so much of a emphasis on emotional and well-being and mental health, etc., can it be that it's more important to him to find a team that's just plays at a high level and tries their hardest, tries their best, and as he pointed out, is aware and I forgot the exact terminology he used, but basically that they had the mental presence and understanding to focus in key moments of the games, basically pointing out that J.R. Smith and his teammates weren't able to do that during the finals.
Right.
Maybe he's just looking for a team of guys that are more complimentary on and off the court, and that might be. He talked
about basketball IQ and guys who think the game out of the box and stuff like that.
Right.
Which was really interesting. I think when we talk about LeBron, we talk about fit and where it would make sense, but just the fact that he didn't care necessarily about being around he didn't say, I need to be around guys who space the floor for me. I need to be around good three-point shooters, which is kind of how everybody always talks about LeBron and his circumstance and the kind of the context of a team he needs to be included in. But he's just like, I just want guys who I could freaking be on the same level with and think the game at the same level that I think the game. I think that Houston would be a great fit for that with guys like James Harden and Chris Paul. That was the first team I thought of. But is Houston a good fit for his family? I mean, it kind of goes. That has to be a consideration. Are there any other teams or circumstances that you look at for LeBron that is substantially better than what he has right now in Cleveland? It would be worth making that move.
I don't know. As far as from a title perspective, I think the clear favorite there, unless you're going to go to Golden State, and that seems very unlikely, is that he goes to Boston. And then there was a great piece from Jonathan Tjarks over at the Ringer, kind of laying out what it would take. They've got the assets in place. They would have to move a couple players in order to accommodate him. From the Celtics fans' perspective, they've been kind of hesitant because they like that young core and the way they've built that team. I've seen some people actually state that they wouldn't want to have LeBron James on that roster because he dominates so much of the conversation and shifts the focus primarily onto him because he's such a singularly great player. I think that's ludicrous. If you can get LeBron James, I don't care what team you are or who you have on that roster, you get LeBron James. But having said that, I think that's his best chance at a title, is to go there and maybe you trade Gordon Hayward, maybe you keep him. It seems unlikely that you would pair him alongside Kyrie Irving, who made the move to get away from there. But it's tough to kind of figure it out. I mean, obviously, I've also heard people say that he's already aware what he's going to do, and some people are unequivocally saying that he's leaving Cleveland. So there seems to be a lot of different perspectives there. I don't know if the league I don't know if he's going to take as long. I get the feeling he's going to be a little bit quicker about his decision. Not holding the league at bay, because things have to fall in place. If he's going to build a team around him, if he goes to a team and they have to make trades in order to accommodate him, then you also have to lure other potential free agents so that you can build a stronger roster. We've seen in Cleveland, we've seen in Miami, that if he takes too long making that decision, guys can sign elsewhere. That limits your chances of being able to build a better, more complete roster around him.
And for the record, I think he is leaving Cleveland, and I just not because I just think I feel like back in 2010 when he left Cleveland, it feels very similar in that whatever relationship it is between him and the organization has sort of run its course, and I don't know that it could. And he's had enough there, and just for his own mental health and well-being, it might be time for a move. And you're right, I do think that he needs to make a decision quicker, not wait as long as he did back in 2014, because he's gonna he is going to have to rely on free agency as far as putting a championship caliber team around him. So, look, we'll move on from there. We're going to be talking about the LeBron James thing, I have a feeling, for a few weeks, if not a couple of months here. But let's move on. After parting ways with Stan Van Gundy, the Pistons have hired its new head coach. We'll talk about that next. But first, the season is over, but the offseason is underway, and things in the NBA can change every day. That means you need a daily podcast to break down everything that's happening around the league. So subscribe to Locked On NBA if you're not already on iTunes or your favorite podcasting app. The Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, David, let's talk a few of these big storylines that are happening around the league with a game of true or false. And we'll start with the one in Detroit. True or false, the Pistons hired former Raptors coach Dwane Casey, who is an upgrade over Stan Van Gundy.
Ooh, I think it's a wash. I'm going to go with neither true nor false. I think there are things that Casey does best, better than Van Gundy, and conversely, I think Stan excels mostly on the court. I think his X's and O's are probably better than Casey's. We've seen him kind of be able to maximize what a player can do, whether it was in Miami or Orlando or in Detroit. I think his understanding of what to do exceeds Casey's in-game decision-making process, which has been heavily criticized even as Toronto was achieving a lot of success. It clearly was one of the things that stood out in the 4-game sweep where they fell to LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers in the playoffs. And I think that's what a lot of the criticism about Casey has been. Now, the thing that Casey does best is relate to players, connect with them, kind of make a great relationship out of a player-coach one. And I think with Detroit's roster, when you got guys like Reggie Jackson, Blake Griffin, who probably never really got along to that same level with Doc Rivers in Los Angeles, Andre Drummond, who has been through Van Gundy, he's been through other coaches and just hasn't been able to get to that same level, to the level that a lot of players expect him to. I see Casey being able to relate to these guys at a different level and a more complete, better one, and bring out more in their individual games. I think he's going to be good for at least a 5 to 10 game swing improvement.
I think a key part here too is the fact that Stan Van Gundy was central in running that organization. He was essentially the general manager and the coach, and that's no longer the case. And I think just having Dwane Casey, an experienced head coach, who you're right, I think could probably mentor and kind of just coach up the players a little bit more behind the scenes than Stan Van Gundy tends to do. Maybe that, I think that combination of having a true head coach in place and a true general manager and that separation of powers is going to be an improvement for Detroit. Ed Stefanski, who is the senior advisor right now, had a hand in hiring Dwane Casey. It looks like he's going to have a hand in constructing that team. Just having multiple guys on deck to rebuild that roster and coach up that group in general will be an upgrade over basically the Stan Van Gundy fiefdom that was being run in Detroit. True or false, DeAndre Ayton is confident he'll be the number 1 pick. It's a done deal that the Suns are taking him.
Despite my inclinations, I think it's true. I think he is going to be the number 1 overall pick. A lot of people much more plugged in as far as what the draft entails and what these teams are thinking as far as their overall thought process tend to think that Ayton is going to be the number 1 selection, that Phoenix views his impact on that team as greater in the long term, while Doncic is a more complete player that could probably come in and make an immediate impact. Well, Phoenix is far from being able to compete at a high level just yet, but adding Ayton makes them a better player, a better team in the future. You can pair him along with Devin Booker and kind of build your foundational core moving forward, maybe get a free agent here and there, somebody else that can kind of, add to that in the future. And I think that's where they see it. Ayton seems pretty confident, as you pointed out. I think that's with good reason. I think he's probably talked to the team, and they probably feel confident in being able to work something out with him.
He made that comparison to Kobe and Shaq being Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton. Good sales pitch by Ayton, for sure. Yeah. But look, we know that Phoenix was enamored with Clint Capella, that there were reports that they would be willing to offer him something close to a max contract as Clint Capella enters restricted free agency. They certainly value that sort of player, that more, not traditional, but a guy who can do things at the rim and on both ends of the floor, as far as just being able to finish pick and rolls and maybe have a little bit of a back to the basket game, as well as defend the rim. They value that. They want that. And so for those reasons, I do think Ayton is probably the favorite right now to be the number one pick. I don't know if it's a done deal. I think Luka Doncic has a real chance to be the pick and should have a real consideration there. But everybody who's more plugged in, like you said, more plugged in than us, writing about this situation, writing about the team, is writing as if Ayton is already there. And it's kind of, the next phase of the formula is so to speak, is what free agents do you pair with Ayton and Devin Booker if Phoenix is trying to kind of, build up that team and try to make a run in the immediate, in the short term. So, yeah, I think Doncic would be the better pick. I still think he's the better player, and at this point I would just take the better player and the more versatile player. But it sounds like Ayton's going to be their guy, and either way, I think it's a good fit next to Devin Booker. I just hope that they're not being a team that says that just falls in love with the best 7-footer, which we've seen backfire several times. Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I don't think it's going to be a Greg Oden, Kevin Durant kind of thing. The question about Doncic, I think, is his athleticism. I think is the biggest knock on him, and I can't help but think that there is some consideration that of his European background, that maybe he wasn't the kind of player that you could watch closely, or maybe that game doesn't translate to the league, which I think is personally ludicrous. But I think Ayton's an incomplete player, a project. I mean, he's got great athleticism and everything else, but at the same time, considering the way the league is trending, do you really want to invest that kind of pick on a player like Ayton? It's a curious decision. I understand that long-term projection there and the hope that maybe he'll turn out to be a more complete player than he's shown in his 1 year in college. But at the same time, that seems like an awful big risk over a player like Doncic, who I think is better suited to make an immediate impact, despite whatever prejudices you might have about the EuroLeague.
Yeah, and the fact that maybe they couldn't watch him. I mean, Igor Kokoskov definitely has first-hand experience with Doncic, but he's not the one ultimately making the decision, right? It's general managers and ownership and things like that. And they've certainly been able to watch Ayton, who was, in the same state playing college basketball as opposed to Doncic, who was overseas. All right, let's talk about the Warriors championship parade, which is going to happen today, and we'll talk about how we can make it more exciting than the last game of the NBA Finals was next. But first, in addition to the daily Locked On NBA show, the Locked On Podcast Network has a daily show for your favorite NBA team. So go to iTunes or your favorite podcasting app and search for your team. Say, for example, the Miami Heat, David? Then subscribe to Locked On Heat. The Locked On Podcast Network, the local experts on the biggest stories.
The Locked On Podcast Network covers every NBA and NFL team, plus a growing list of Major League Baseball teams. So when a big story breaks and you want the local experts, you go to the Locked On Podcast Network. Where? At LockedOnSports.com. Bookmark LockedOnSports.com. It's the home for your local experts on all the biggest stories. LockedOnSports.com.
It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Warriors will host their championship parade today in Oakland. It's something we've all seen coming and have all seen already. They did the same thing last June. David, do you have any interest in watching this parade at all?
No, absolutely not. Having been to a parade with the Heat, I can tell you that those are very uncomfortable situations to actually be in and to witness. And I'm not particularly interested. You get a lot of hungover, probably even still drunk players talking a lot to try and boost their fans and tell them that everything's going to be great and everything's going to be fine. But, in reality, who knows what's going to happen next year? Kevin Durant could leave in free agency. Steph Curry could get hurt. Who knows? I personally have never been much for the parade, unless it's a team that I'm following actually doing the winning. But at the same time, watching Golden State go through this process for the third time in 4 years. Now, I will say there is the hot Cheeto Draymond Green factor that might be worth watching. And there's also Nick Young. You never know what he might say. There's also JaVale McGee. I think he's a guy who could be a little bit of a loose cannon up there. You never know. He might say something interesting and funny. So those are things to consider. But, for me, it just doesn't hold the same kind of interest as it does for others.
Yeah, I mean, look, and if any of those things happen, they'll have Instagram and Twitter clips that you can just watch afterwards, so you don't have to waste your time watching the whole parade. You just catch all the... I have no interest... I don't have interest in parades in general. I'm not a parade person. I never understood...
Is anybody anymore? I mean, I mean, it seems like the parades were something that you did in the 50s and 60s, but nowadays...
now people have better things to do, like browse their Instagram feed.
There you go.
You're right. I don't know. I think people like parades.
Still?
People show up to them. Like there is a segment of the population that shows up to these parades. You've been to Disney World and they have parades every night there.
Oh,
there is, and that must cost a fortune to put on. So there must be a return on investment. I feel like there is a segment of the population that they just don't host podcasts, I suppose. I have no interest in this parade. I think it's always the same thing. The guys are on floats. Sometimes they get off the floats. They throw things to the audience like T-shirts and candy and whatever, and they wave. Steve Kerr will say something charming, and everybody will lose their minds. And fans of the Warriors will appreciate it and enjoy it. And I guess you can just sort of revel in the overall atmosphere of being a champion team, and that's great if you're a Warriors fan. For me, I would like to see, and look, the parade is not for the general population. The parade is for the fans, right? And so with that in mind, I get it, but it would be interesting to see them do it differently and do something interesting. I don't know what could be done to make this thing more interesting. Maybe have the players actually get out of the float and walk and interact, or I don't know. I have no idea. I have no idea what would make a parade more interesting.
It's too hot. It's too hot for any of that. Like being to the one in Miami, and even though I imagine the one in the Bay is probably pretty hot there. I can't imagine, it's always during the summer, so I can't imagine that it's not going to be a particularly hot environment. You're going to get people drinking. You're going to get people who take clothes off and make jackasses of themselves. And I guess that's part of the fun, maybe? I don't know. It's tough to say. Maybe not have a parade, but at the same time, have it like at an outdoor venue, maybe.
Ooh, like a concert.
Yeah, something like that. But that limits the number of fans. Like you saw what happened in Cleveland, and I think those crowds had to have been a record, right? Just that kind of turnout for an Ohio championship, something that hadn't happened in a century and a half or whatever.
50 plus years. I mean,
no, that number grows every time.
The only way to make a parade exciting is for the team to not have won for 50 plus years, and in the Warriors' case, it was 12 months. So.
I think the Warriors parade is a lot like the season. Like it was perfunctory in the sense that everybody knew they were going to wind up doing this anyway. I imagine some of the luster is probably worn off, some of the joy. Like even going through the season, as much as we enjoyed covering and talking about it, there was that feeling that they were going to wind up exactly where they did. And I think that's probably taken some of the, like I said, some of the luster off of it.
And taking the parade planning out, like the stress of parade planning out of it. I mean,
that never changes.
They rehashed the blueprint.
Having been in as part of the city administration, like I saw that up close. Like the police presence is so well planned, and it's such a pain in the ass, to be quite honest with you.
It's not even worth
streets have to be blocked off. It's amazing. It's terrible and wonderful at the same time,
I guess. But and any Warriors fans listening to this are probably very excited about this parade. I hope you have a great time if you go and attend the parade. Oakland, the night that they won the finals, was crazy. That I'm sure that you guys all had a great time. I hope you enjoy the parade, but I won't be watching the parade, and there's really nothing you can do to convince me otherwise. I do like the idea of turning it into a venue, maybe having a show where celebrities show up and have E40 show up and do a few of his songs, and have some other maybe rappers and people, like have Drake show up. He shows up to all championship things. Have Drake show up.
Every team, yeah.
Have Drake show up and let Steph and JaVale McGee rap along with him and just do hotline bling dances and things. That to me would be more exciting than a parade where it's just the sit on top of the float and wave. and just show off the trophy. But
I'd rather do it like the day after too, where the players are so hammered that they don't have a chance to recover. Just kind of get it over with like a Band-Aid. Go get the parade over and done with. Let's see you make a complete and total drunken buffoon of yourself. That would be the most fun, I think.
There we go. Well, hope you enjoy it for those who are going, and if you're not going, join the club and do something better with your day. But that's all we have for today. So you can subscribe to Locked On NBA on iTunes, your favorite podcast app, if you're not already. We'll be back next Tuesday here. In the meantime, you can find us on Locked On Heat. Thank you for listening, and thanks for joining me, David.
You got it, Wes.
Thanks for tuning in to Locked On NBA. We hope you're enjoying the new 5-day-a-week format of Locked On NBA, the place for you to get your quick, digestible look at what's happening in the NBA on a daily basis. Reminder to you that every single one of the NBA teams has a daily Locked On podcast as well. So go find your favorite team and subscribe to their Locked On podcast, available on iTunes, Spotify, and all of your podcatchers. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Your company can advertise on the Locked On Podcast Network, and the first thing you'd get is a passionate, connected listener about a team they love. Now, the second part is all data, so here you go. You get an audience that's 98% male, between the ages of 18 and 54 almost entirely. According to Edison Research, podcast listeners are 50% more likely to have a college degree, and 30% of podcast listeners have a graduate degree. So you're reaching a more affluent, a better educated, and a connected audience for your company. We'd love to have you be a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. You can email me, David Locke, at lockedonpodcast@gmail.com. Put your company in position to succeed by working with us, the Locked On Podcast Network, the #1 sports daily podcast network. Email me, David Locke, at lockedonpodcast@gmail.com.